So we'll be moving away from the neuroscience for a bit now. So, okay, and I just want to put these names out at the front. So all of the work in my lab is collaborative in some senses or another. In my lab, for what I'm going to talk about, Yvette Cologne, Matt Hill, who's here, Ailey Noyes, Connor Parda, and I forgot Diana there. And University of Maryland, Carlos is here, as is Rajiv, but the additional names have all contributed. You'll see names go by on slides, but I just like to put them out at the front. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to start with just a very brief overview of the evolution of face spaces. That topic came up in the previous talk, and we'll just run through that really quickly. Then I'm going to talk about why these standard face space models are failing to make progress now as models of human face processing. And then I will switch to face representations in deep convolutional neural networks. Okay, so evolution of face space models. Decades ago, Valentine proposed the standard abstract model, and he proposed it as a framework for uniting a number of diverse results that had come out in the psych literature up to that point. So very few elements to the theory. Faces can be considered as points in a multidimensional space. Axes represent features, and he did not commit to any particular features. And the similarity between faces can be thought of as the distance in the space. Okay, so at the very abstract level, you have a bunch of faces here. And the nice point about this, and Doris pointed this out very well, that you can quantify faces in any kind of a face space in terms of their coordinates with respect to these axes. So you can think of a certain number of feature 1, feature 2, and so on. Okay, so as a psychological theory, these were just help spur research and unite and provide a nice framework for understanding things like typicality effects. So you can imagine the center of a face space is crowded. It's easy to confuse faces there. You can imagine other race effects come about because these faces are characterized by whole sets of different features, and they're sitting out somewhere else in the space. And so in the psychological side of things, face spaces became very useful. About the same time, there were computational instantiations of these face spaces. So in particular, a principal component analysis of images, aka Eigenfaces as we've seen it, became popular in a couple of different literatures. And what that bought for the face space model was to give us a set of concrete features, things we knew. We knew that the dimensions were eigenfaces, and you could reason about eigenfaces, and so on. And this had some pros and cons. So as a psych theory, it gave us a way of generating some testable predictions about various things, including typicality, other race effects, and so on. It allowed us to tailor a particular face space to certain sets of faces. And it also was just generally good for research because it gave us lots of things to hold on to, so to speak, in the space. On the computational side, suffice to say that Eigenfaces was really the first operational engine of computational face recognition systems. So it was successful both in the psych side and in the computational side. But it has a big problem, and we all know what that problem is. It has really no ability to operate over even small changes in viewpoint or even trivial changes in image size and so on. There are ways to tweak this, and people tweak it, and it works a little bit better, but it's still a problem, okay? So as things go in literatures of this sort, there was a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift was built around an understanding that the problem with eigenfaces is that it models the image, okay? And generally speaking, psychologists and computer graphics people and lots of people, we would prefer to model the information in the face. But there's a big problem in modeling the information in the face. In 1991, we only had images about, in the early 90s, maybe mid-90s, it became possible to really measure the face in a comprehensive way. So laser scans appear on the scene, and all of a sudden there's lots of data about the three-dimensional surface structure of faces as well as the overlying reflectance map. And so now you at least have the raw materials to build a model that would model more than the face image, but the face. And that's the better thing. The obstacle, of course, was this problem in the computer vision, solving the correspondence problem. And I won't go on about that, but that was a 30-year trek through computer vision and lots of things other than faces. You have to be able to align the features so that you're essentially quantifying how faces differ from each other rather than how images differ from each other. So suffice to say that somewhere around the mid-90s and earlier, depending upon whether you did it in 2D or 3D, and I will not go into too much detail. Doris talked about a 2D version of this. I'll just concentrate on the 3D for time. 3D morphable models made enough progress in solving the correspondence problem that they were, in fact, able to model the face, not the image anymore. Okay? And Blands and Vetter are the ones who really made the most progress on that and got that to work. Okay, so this gives rise, when you're modeling the face rather than modeling the image, this gives rise to a face space with very different properties than the ones we had gotten used to. I just want to be specific about what was the input to the principal component analysis, because we're still doing principal component analysis here. But instead of principal component analysis on images, you're working on the output of laser scans of human faces. And in particular, what Blands and Vetter and others have analyzed is complete information about how the shape of individual faces differ from some average, because now we're in correspondence. And Doris talked about that with the 2D projections in a 2D version. And also with the laser scans, you get reflectance, or albedo. Okay, so that's a very complete model. The most important thing to hold on to here is that what we were modeling is the three-dimensional deformation from the average face, okay? And this was a very powerful representation. It is a very, very powerful representation because it's a kind of natural prototype model. And also, it gives us a continuous face space, so you can morph completely through this space and never leave the space, never end up with double chins and double necks and things of that sort. And also, it gave us a way to find identity in the space, in that identity is just a trajectory through the space from the average out to progressively more distinctive versions of faces. So we're all kind of familiar with this by now, I would think. I don't know if the pointer will work here. But you can see the identity trajectory in the space from an average image here out into an original. And if you keep going, you get a caricature. So what varies in this space is varying very precisely, going from the average out into the peripheral parts of the space. Okay, and you're going through anti-caricature lines and ultimately to the original face. And this hit a really high degree of computer graphics at this point, so the quality here is excellent. So the pros of this model, many of us know pretty well. It's a prototype model. It does caricaturing with very little effort. It was really a nice support structure for investigating adaptation and opponent codes and all those great things. And in computer graphics, it was a huge success on creating avatars and things of that sort. So it has a lot of applications. But this model also has a problem. And the problem has been hinted at so far. There's no way to model image-based effects in face processing, and therefore no way to model familiarity, or no obvious way to model familiarity in image generalization. And so this brings us to part two. So why these models now fail to make progress on understanding human face processing. So the problem is, of course, Rob Jenkins. Okay, Rob Jenkins published this nice paper in 2011. I'm sure, who has not seen it? Everybody's seen it for posterity, and in fact that we're recording it, I'll just at least say The task here was to say how many identities are pictured. Everyone says lots, like 7 and so on. As it turns out, there are really only 2 identities here, Rob Jenkins, who Doris promoted to a movie star status earlier in her talk, and some other person. Okay, so obviously, when we know faces really well, this is something we have no problems with. As we can see here, these are wildly different images. And actually, case in point here, these are all mostly frontal, and it's still hard. Okay? But by the time we get familiar with a face, we can do a lot more. Okay? So to state the obvious, the hallmark of face familiarity is we're able to generalize identification over changes in pose, illumination, expression, and appearance. Okay? So the problem with morphable models is that there's no way to model familiarity, and that's because no face in that network or in that face space is represented any better than any other face. One face is one point in the space, and that's it. So if you think about what you would need to model familiarity with a face space, let's just put these 2 things forward. You would want to be able to say how familiar face representations are somehow or other superior to unfamiliar face representation. And once you do that, it would be nice to know how a representation would support better recognition generalization when we experience more and more diverse versions of the person as we get to know them. So on to the stage in roughly 2012 come deep convolutional neural networks, and that takes me to really the main part of this talk, which is understanding the face representations developed in these networks. Okay? So if you have not lived under a rock the past few years, you will be aware of deep convolutional neural networks. The reason we're talking about them here is they actually do solve the problem of generalization to a pretty good extent. They are, as Krzyzewski put them out there, multiple layers of simulated neurons. They convolve and pool image data. Most of the architectures, and this should sound familiar to the neuroscience people, most of the architectures allow for representation expansion quite a bit in the early and intermediate layers, and then things are forced through a bottleneck at the end, usually through one or more fully connected layers. And out the other end comes what is considered a final representation of an image that is surprisingly compact. Okay, this is what I just said with a picture. You've got images going in this end, and then you see huge expansion of the representation, and then, last but not least, a kind of strong compression at the other end. So as for many other areas of computer vision, DCNNs now really are the state of the art. The image goes in through these multiple layers here, sometimes a few, sometimes many. And out the other side comes what I will call a top-level face representation, and it's a pretty compact vector. Okay, so I should point out, for those of you who are not from the computational area, in face recognition systems, all of the work is done for recognition identification using this tiny code. The rest of the network may not, might as well not exist. Everything goes away but that last representation. And so for this to succeed, for identification to work in these networks, what we hope is that the representation of 2 similar faces or the same identity faces there differs a lot from different identities. So we want these codes to be the same if it's the same person and different if it's different identities. And in fact, we're all here talking about this because these networks succeed on something that would have seemed even 5 to 7 years ago completely implausible. They recognize identity over pretty wild changes in appearance and viewpoint. Okay? So the problem, of course, has been that we don't really understand the visual nature of the codes. It's very puzzling, and it's puzzling for people in neuroscience, it's puzzling for the computational people, it's puzzling for the psych people. But we should excuse ourselves in not understanding this when we think about the complexity of the representation here, both in terms of the number of nonlinear computations that produce this representation, also the uncontrolled nature of the training data, which is not talked about that much, but I'll mention here. So just to give you an example, in terms of nonlinear computations, number of nonlinear computations, this is a network from the University of Maryland groups, affectionately called in the group as SwamiNet. And it, if you pull out a calculator between the input image and the output representation, there's some 39.8 million computations, okay, local computations to get out a 512 element vector, which does all the work. But from Kalinit's paper here, why does this work either? We don't really understand that either. And DCNNs are modeled, designed to model primate visual system. And in fact, there are hundreds of millions of nonlinear computations between the retinotopic image and the IT cortex representation that has some categorical structure to it. Okay, so this is not this is a digression slide here just to mention that there has been good work done in comparing the visual system, primate visual system to DCNNs. Yammans et al., how do you say his name? Yammans and in DiCarlo's group looked at a comparison between neurons and DCNN units for object recognition and found some nice parallels between V1 through V3 responses in early the responses in early network layers here, V4 responses in intermediate layers, and IT responses in top layers. This is a really good paper if you've not had a chance to look at it. Okay. So for the uncontrolled nature of the training data, one of the things that's made DCNNs possible is the fact that you have so many images out on the web. And so these things are trained with web-scraped images, I think that's what they're called. And there's no control. I mean, there's a lot of them, millions. Somebody told me, Pavan, where's Pavan? What was the latest Facebook one? 2.3 billion ones. The Facebook ones had 8 million, early ones, 8 million images of, tens of thousands of identities. And where the control lacks is you have no control over illumination, viewpoint. You don't know how many images if you have of any given identity. You might have a lot of Eta and less of Marge and so on. You might have different diversity. So everything that they could find went into the training. Millions of images, tens of thousands of identities, and no control over any of this stuff. And so that's why more is better. Hopefully you get what you need if you have enough images. So the goal of what I'm going to talk about is to provide some data that hopefully will be helpful in understanding the face representations in DCNNs that actually achieve the robust face recognition that we see in the computational literature. And I'll be talking about completely studying the top level codes. Okay, so the approach is very basic. We started by simply visualizing the space of face representations, and it turned out to be highly structured, as you'll see, but not in any of the ways we predicted. And then I'll talk about analyzing the information that gets retained in the codes at the top. And again, this is kind of not what we expected, but maybe in retrospect we should have expected some of this. And then the third approach will be to probe an uncontrolled network with controlled images. So given that you start with chaos, one way of dissecting out the chaos is to take something very controlled and see how something systematically varying is represented in the face space. So that'll be the third part. Just to tell you, we have 3 papers, 2 out on this and 1 that is almost submitted. Matt just got back from vacation. We'll have something to do when he gets back. But I'll talk about different results from these and hopefully have them all annotated. Okay, so visualization was the first thing we tried, and this was fun to do. So we analyzed top-level features from 2, at the time, state-of-the-art DCNNs. So both of these are University of Maryland algorithms, Chen et al. 2015 and SwamiNet 2016. Sorry, that's what I have to call it. These were developed for the IARPA competition, which Carlos will talk about a little bit after this talk. They were trained on CASIA web-based database, roughly 500,000 images of 10,000 identities. And the top-level feature descriptors here are 320 features out of Jenkins network and 512 out of Swami's net. And so the test set of images we're going to be visualizing is roughly 25,000 images of 500 identities that were not learned by the network. We're using the network as a filter to just show the representations that come out. Okay, so this is the Chen network. It's got, I think, 10 convolutional layers and so on. So just to point out, one of the things in this work, this is SwamiNet, you've seen it before, to point out everything we've done on these, we've done on multiple networks. So that's been the great thing about being part of the Janus program is Carlos's group is producing a new algorithm every 6 months and new data sets, and we just wanted to verify that the results are not really architecture dependent. You get to a critical mass, and this is going to be stable over different architectures. Okay, so visualization. Something that's much more familiar to this community is the ability to come up with a face similarity space. And so what we're going to visualize first is the structure of the space made from 25,000 images. And we used t-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, t-SNE, and it is a dimensionality reduction technique that preserves distances between high-dimensional points in a low-dimensional space using stochastic gradient descent. So for those of you not familiar with it, you can think of it as a multidimensional space. That's what it is. And if those of you want to know more about it, Matt is a specialist and he likes to talk about it. So 320 dimensions, what you're going to look at in the next is the Chen network, 320 dimensions compressed into 2, and it's a mass. Okay, so you can't really see anything here, but it doesn't matter because t-SNE is great and it allows you to expand different parts of the space and focus in and see what's in different places. So at first we thought, well, I wonder if there's a prototype model here. So we went in concentric circles and we pulled things out that were close to the mean, and we did not get averages. We got garbage. So after exploring this network a little bit, we came to the conclusion that the center of the space for a DCNN network is the proverbial garbage dump. It's a bunch of images that are not high quality for all different reasons and pretty unusable as faces. And then we went a little more peripheral, and we got some better images, but most of these aren't looking frontally. And then we went a little further out, and we got even better images and a little bit more frontal, till we got to the outer periphery of this space where we have lovely, pristine, frontally oriented images of lots of people. Okay, so first clue is that the structure of the DCNN space is very different than the ones we've seen before. And certainly we know that in these feature vectors we have information about image quality, which is great for the computational stuff. But also, by way of hint, we have something about viewpoint in these representations. And so to give you a little bit closer look at this, viewpoint obviously because we're seeing systematic changes in profile to frontal as you go further out into the space. But we visualized one identity in this face space made by the top level features. And in the Janus competition, the other really good thing about that competition is for every identity you've got a lot of images. And so looking at, in the embedded visualization, the 25K images of a person we had 140 images of. It's not surprising with this competition that the most images we have is of Vladimir Putin. This is the visualization of all of those images, and you can pretty much draw a little border here between the non-frontal versions of the image and the more frontal. It's not perfect, but it's definitely there. Okay. Okay, so we sometimes, and I'll just say the assumption, it's been out there, we sometimes assume that to achieve robust face recognition, DCNNs or whatever computational model must be able to create a representation that transcends the image data. In other words, deletes or compensates for things like viewpoint illumination and other nuisance variables. And so what we're looking for is a way of eliminating this stuff to get to an extraction of identity information, the face itself. It would seem to be not true for what DCNNs do. But it's also not what the visual system does. And we've seen lots of neuroscience data this morning, and there's lots and lots more, but from the fMRI literature, certainly we find human face selective cortex tuned for things like viewpoint, illumination, size, and position. Okay, so case in point, we can say this space has not deep sixed the image data, but nor has the visual system. Okay, so image data in the top level features, we wanted to put this along a little bit firmer ground, so we did some simulations where we tried to predict the yaw, pitch, and media type. Media type just because the Janus program gave us metadata on that, so whether or not the image came from a video or a still image from the top level features. And we did it in the simplest possible way, linear readout. We did a linear classifier, taking the top level features for each image as the input and trying to predict the yaw, the pitch, and the media type. Okay, this worked very well, and this is held up in every single network we've looked at in the last 2 years. You can predict from the top level features the head angle to about within 8 degrees, the pitch in 3 categories, straight on or up and down, 77, 71% correct. And stunningly, the CNN can tell you from the top level features whether that image came from a video or it came from a still image. And we still don't even know why that is, because it wasn't easy for us to tell. So we hypothesized at this point that maybe some features are coding image data in a way that's invariant. And then by features, I mean like the output units, the 512 representation, and maybe some are tuned to the image data, so you've got 2 kinds of neurons up there, so to speak. And so what we did is we took one sample case where we had lots of images, profile and frontal images, and we checked the robustness of individual features across view change. So looking at the view tuning of these units. So we reasoned that top-level features invariant to view change should give the same feature value regardless of whether or not a profile comes in or a frontal image comes in. And conversely, top-level features that are view-dependent should show systematic differences in feature values as a function of the profile versus the full. Okay, so our expected result was that some of our features would be view-tuned and some of our features would not be. And we were wrong about that, too. Okay, so there's a little bit of a busy slide here, but it's easy to understand when you go through it slowly. What we have here in the rows are the deep features, and what we have in the columns are individual face identities. And so we had many images of each identity. And what is plotted here is whether or not the feature values for profile images of the person versus frontal images of the person differed significantly. So standard t-test kind of thing. Yellow is significant differences, purple is non-significant differences. We expected, on the hypothesis I gave you on the last slide, to see horizontal bands of energy such that certain deep features would be going invariantly and some would be going variantly. And that's not what we got at all. We got really the inverse of that. We got strong vertical bands of energy such that certain identities were coded in a way that was view invariant, and other identities were encoded in a way that was very view variant across all or most of the features. So that was very confusing. We obviously pulled out immediately the identities that were coded variantly versus invariantly, and although it's not possible to say this categorically, because there's so many identities, it seemed like things encoded invariantly had features like baldness, or Bono was one of them with his little blue glasses, that kind of you can detect that feature across many views and so on. And then the more variantly coded people had kind of less to hang on to that seemed to be uniting across view. So the interim conclusions at this point would be to say that a representation of faces in DCNN certainly retains a lot of detail about the images. Identity codes, not features, operate in a way that is view-dependent or view-independent. This is like nice, right? I like this. So identities are either coded in a way that's more view variable or more view invariant. So that gives us the potential to see how an identity could go from being variantly coded to invariantly coded. But let's just leave that out there for a second. Okay, so for the third method, we decided to probe our networks with controlled images and visualize the representation of the image variables. Okay, so the goal here is to investigate the organization of information encoded in the top-level representation. And so in particular, we focused on identity, we focused on gender, we focused on viewpoint, and we focused on illumination. Okay? And our approach here is to, for lack of a better way to say this, probe an in-the-wild network with an in-the-lab data set. Okay? So just to be clear, before we go into specific methods, the two types of image data we're contrasting here is this in-the-wild images, the ones I showed you before. They're web-scraped, they're unbalanced, we don't really know how many identities or viewpoints, and unconstrained viewing conditions, against what is the opposite extreme, which here is going to be highly controlled laser scans of faces. These are the ones from the Max Planck Institute. And these give you full information about the human head and also the ability to render images under arbitrary conditions of viewpoint and illumination and so on. Okay? All right, so we had a two-part approach here. We created the DCNNs, the Maryland group created the DCNNs, so using the uncontrolled methods. So Rajiv's network is the second one here, and Junchan's is the first, and everything generalizes. And then what we do is project the controlled images into this face space created from the wild data set. Okay, and then in the second part, we're going to use the power of the 3D morphable model to change the salience of identity information, so making caricatures and so on, to trace how identity per se lays out in this network. Okay, so face identification DCNNs, I want to start by saying first, the data I'm going to present is on network A, and we're going to probably use Rajiv's better network in the paper, so that's where those demonstrations will come from. So again, 500,000 images and so on. The training images varied in all these things in the wild, but not systematically. Just to let you know, this is a really good network. It was state-of-the-art in 2016. It was developed for the Janus competition. It performs very well on the IJBA data set, which was developed for the Janus competition, very difficult set. And then just recently in a PNAS paper from Jonathan Phillips in our lab and the Maryland people, this network is at the level of forensically trained fingerprint examiners on a very difficult face identification that we developed for forensic examiners. Okay, so it's good at identification. So the controlled images came from the MPI data set, 133 laser scans, half male and half female, and these were rendered systematically with changes in viewpoint and illumination. Picture worth 1,000 words here. So here's a particular identity, and it was rendered from 0 through 60 degrees under ambient illumination versus harsh spotlight illumination. So the network has the very challenging task of grouping these all together as the single identity. Okay, so it's a difficult task. The data that we analyzed as before was essentially take the face images, run them through. So these are the rendered face images. We've lost the 3D data at this point. The rendered face images through the network to produce their little codes here. And then we're going to visualize the face space that results from this 133 multi-rendered and so on. So what you're going to see on the next few slides is exactly the same face space, but we have color-coded it differently to highlight how identities are grouped versus genders versus illumination versus viewpoint. Okay, so on this slide here, we see the grouping by identity with little polygons surrounding identities here. If you look at the accuracy of this network on the MPI data that I just described, it's area under the ROC of 0.99, so virtually no mistakes. A couple of these long lines indicate ones that were misgrouped. Gender, okay, so there is a nice similarity space from here. The coding does mostly separate the male and female sides of the space. Illumination was fascinating. Illumination, this looks like little DNA strands here. You can pull this out here. So within an identity, the ambient lit faces of that identity are here. The spotlight lit faces of the identity are there. And viewpoint was the most interesting. So here, pulling out this little section again within an identity, 0 through 60 degrees, what you're seeing here is a grouping in the DCNN space at the top that is super, super structured. Okay, so that's all good. Just to back this up with some quantitative data, we did gender classification, came out 90% correct, illumination 97% correct, viewpoint prediction, average error of 7.97. Again, these are from the representations that come out the DCNN. So far, we know that a DCNN, by the way, I should say, is trained for identity discrimination, doesn't know anything about gender, doesn't know anything about viewpoint, or at least nothing explicitly, does retain these other obviously salient visual variables. And they're hierarchically organized. So you've got an identity, and sitting in an identity, you've got some illumination conditions, and sitting in the illumination conditions, you've got a little array of viewpoints. At the end, the image and the identity information can be read out, linearly, can be read out linearly from the top-level feature representation. So all good. Okay, so next we wanted to use the power of the Morphable model to kind of figure out what happens with the identity coding in ways that are psychologically salient, like salient for caricature and things of that sort. So probably some of you are familiar with this, but again, drawing the line through the face space from the average out toward a caricature, you can generate a face where more or less identity strength increases. Anti-caricatures are weak identity strengths, and caricatures and verticals are stronger identity strengths. So here, what we did is went back to the MPI data set, and Volker Bland's I didn't mention him in the acknowledgments. Volker Bland's is involved in this as well. Generated a nice morph line here for all of our identities, and then we just basically ran them all back through the network and plotted the face space again. Okay, so this will take a little bit of explanation, but bear with me. Am I doing okay on time? I guess I am. So we didn't have enough colors for identity here, so we repeated them. But what we see here is a little bit different than what we saw before. So we see some nice areas here where identities are very nicely separated. You can even see the separation by illumination and all that. And some places here where it would appear that now the DCNN is confusing identities. Okay, so now we have a little mixed thing there. However, and again, we're going to be showing the same data again and again, but recoded by color to see interesting aspects of it. If you look inside of these mixed identity clusters, there's a very good explanation. And that explanation is the network can't categorize the weak identity strength faces. So the 0.25 and the 0.50 anti-caricatures aren't with their respective identity. They're stuck somewhere else, okay? Where else is very interesting. So where else is, so you can see these clusters of weak identity strengths here that mix the identities, okay? So just to let you know, gender is still very prominent in this space, and you can still see the mixed identity clusters and the separated identity clusters. But now focusing in on half of this and looking at individual dimensions, not a good word here. If you look at the illumination, you can start to see also illumination is separated. But in the case where identity is messed up, illumination is clustered. Okay, so when you can't tell the identity, there is some aspect of clustering these anti-caricatures with weak identity strengths with every other one that's lit the same way. Okay, image properties being more salient in this case when the identity is weak. And again, here we see the same idea with viewpoint here. Here, the subset of one illumination, one gender, part of the space coded by viewpoint. Here we see, again, an image variable dominating over the identity variable when the identity strengths are too weak to come out. Okay, so, sorry, there you have it all, okay? So it's, in a sense, it's a grouping based on the best available information when identity is not working for it. Okay, so a little bit in summary here, we have a face space where gender is bifurcated very nicely, so that preserves the older properties of the good face spaces that we've come to know and love. And then you have identity strength here as being, I think, the psychological analogy of typicality. I mean, the 1979 Lee Light paper that's everybody can replicate with no work at all, and caricaturing effects, which actually we're working a little bit more on now, is evident in this grouping and in this structure. And then here we have the image variables coexisting very peacefully and very harmoniously with the identity variable in the same unified face space. Okay, so the implications of this are that the DCNN face space is creating something like a hierarchically nested pattern of similarity. I want to be careful not to confuse this with Riesenhuber and Poggio's model, which is also called hierarchically something. So we have to, but this means something a little bit different. I would argue, and I think by now I hope you would agree, this is a fundamentally different face space than we have seen in any of the previous models we've looked at. It arises spontaneously from a network trained for identity. And one thing I really like about it is it shows coding flexibility when the variable of choice isn't working for you. So instead of misgrouping these anti-caricatures into the closest identity, which older computer vision models would have done, this one's saying, okay, I can't tell what these ones are, so let's just put them all together into image categories. Is this a good model of the human visual system? I don't know. But it certainly makes us think about things in ways that I would not have a priori generated without seeing it. So with that, I would say there's a lot to do. There's a lot of investigation to do. There's a lot of exploration to do. There's a huge gulf between the neuroscience and the modeling that needs to be addressed and thought about. But it is certainly, I think, on first principles, these things should be considered seriously as psychological models and seriously as neuroscience models, if only because they actually solve the task. So I should also maybe editorially say, from the perspective of an outsider on the computer vision field, for the last 30 years, I've followed it with great interest. And I sort of feel like we have a situation now where the dog has been chasing the fire truck for 30 years, and it finally has caught the fire truck and doesn't really know what to do with it. So the DCNN has had a fair amount of pushback just on, it's like, oh, we don't understand how it works. And the computation people, I don't care as long as my network's better than the next guy's. The neuroscience people care a lot, the psych people care a lot, but I think at this point, it's worth looking at. So I have to have this thank you to IARPA here, and the work was supported by IARPA in the Janus program. And so Carlos will have the same one. So thanks to my lab and to all the people who participated in putting this together. So I think that's it.
Is there a reason why your picture segregates the blonde from everything?
So this is the best. I'm getting a good picture of everybody for the lab is really difficult. And Ailey came a little bit late, and we already had this picture. We all liked ourselves in the picture, so I just floated her on top. Sorry. I probably have better pictures, but not everybody's in every cool picture. Yes. Yes, Bruno.
Thank you, Alice. We know that human face recognition is pretty good under conditions of occlusion, distortion, severe distortion. In Pavan has shown that Graham Hall, blurring, very small images. once you've trained the network like this extensively, have you tried to test with those kinds of manipulations to see?
Yeah, so actually we haven't got, I mean, that would be on the list of really interesting things to do. What I will say from a paper Jonathan Phillips has last year in Face and Gesture is, if anything, DCNNs are better at the bad data. They're really better at the bad data than the good data. And the previous generation of algorithms got, sort of super peaked out at really high-res, good quality data. So that's something that sits out there. These networks are great at generalization because they don't care about high-resolution stuff. By the time you hit that top-level representation, resolution is just not an issue.
But how about occlusion?
Oh, occlusion is, I don't know, Carlos, can you say something about that? I don't know if we specifically tested occlusion. It's on the list. It would be a good thing to test.
Because everything's based on physical features, right? I mean, you presented the challenge with the slide from Rob's work, where people are much better with familiar than unfamiliar faces. But
Okay,
in the
so
human
that's
brain,
not modeled at all.
yeah, in the human brain, you
This
use
just
your
gives
semantics.
us, yeah, this just gives us.
So you go beyond features. Here, it's purely based on physical features. So it's very impressive. They managed to do that.
Yeah, well, so the modeling of familiarity with this thing is just a future thought. I have lots of thoughts about it. And actually, the good thing about the Janus competition is they basically had many images of the same person. And so the way they would handle that part is they'd run everything through the network. They'd get 100 images of Bruno, and they would form a Bruno template by doing nothing more complex than averaging the top-level feature vectors with a couple of extra tricks thrown in and using the template. We do have strong data to suggest the more images that contribute to that template, the better the recognition. That was like the first thing we did in the Janus analysis. And that holds very strong. So if you have lots of images of somebody, the recognition of the network of that identity will improve.
Okay, thanks.
But there are lots of more ways to do that. Yes?
You showed some, there was like a barcode-like figure that you put up, and I think you were saying, based on that figure, that some of the identities were encoded in a relatively invariant way, some in a more kind of variant way. That sounds a lot like a familiarity effect. Was there anything?
It does sound like a familiarity effect. And that, when we first got that result, we just didn't understand it. And I think we're coming to understand it a little better. I think there are two things to invariant coding, and one is familiarity, but the other is just some people have features that generalize better across different viewpoints. So if you're bald, you can see that from like lots of different views. But if you're looking at Bruno, but other people are harder to code, and that's the nature of faces. So typical faces that look like everybody else with typical hairdos and stuff, those are the worst. So there are two components to it, and nobody has yet sorted out the part that has to do with the number of images in a template versus the invariance.
Okay.
Of the person per se.
So just to be clear about where that result came from, could it be that there were more images of some people than others?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Totally could be the case. Now, that heat map, Matt, was like basically restricted to identities in the database where we had at least 35, if I recall, 20 frontals and 20 profiles. So we had enough images in frontal and profile to do a t-test. And lots of identities, we did not have that number.
I think that fits really nicely with what we know about the psychology, though, because, I mean, I learned your face. That didn't help me at all learn the next person's face.
Exactly.
Right? I had to start from scratch. So it's almost like we have to construct an individual face space for each person that we learn.
Right.
And that kind of really resonates with the kind of...
But it's a puzzle for interpreting the neurons, of course, because that says that it's not really appropriate to talk about a view-tuned neuron, which is profound and premature, but scary. Because if the neuron can operate invariantly for some identities, I mean, if you look at that heat map, it's very clear that a neuron's really coding invariantly for some identities and not invariantly for the other ones. Then that makes that very, very difficult to interpret. I mean, not for me, because I actually think really the computational literature would suggest that most of the semantic information in this face space is in directions through the space, not necessarily in features as detectors. And so when you think about the projections down of semantic information in high-dimensional space onto just whatever happens to be your neural landing pad, it could be anything. Sometimes it does this, sometimes it does that, and it's not that. So it's not a mystery. We talked about that in the recent TICS paper. Why this is not surprised that those units could act view invariantly and view variantly at different cases.
Didn't we have that at the time of the dual models? Remember when we were just saying that you can recognize a face either as a face or just as an object, and the object part was the part that people with prosopagnosia, like Lynette, could do without any problem, as long as you were helping her making the feature easily identifiable. Remember what that old stuff about
It's
what
the
we
duality
called,
between the image
what we were
and-
calling the recognition by disfiguration, when we're putting features on people like scars and stuff like that, and then you'd become automatically recognizable through transfer, and you would be recognizable by prosopagnosic patients. So I think it sounds very much like that.
Jim?
There are a couple of things that confuse me.
Me too. So.
One is that, you said something about how the visual system doesn't disentangle ID, but it does.
It does. No, I didn't.
So let me,
say it didn't.
and if, so from the Freiwald and Chow work and the human work from Ida and Swaroop, we know very clearly that there's a progression along the phase processing pathway from a viewpoint representation to an identity representation. And I bet if you looked at that T-SNE, what do you call it, T-SNE?
Kalinet corrected my pronunciation when I've been saying
fancy
T-SNE, and
MDS
she goes, no, it's
you've got.
T-SNE.
It's a fancy MDS. But if you looked at that, I bet if you, constructed a representational geometry of all those images, it would just look just exactly like Doris's and Ida's, where you would get these stripes
And that's
for
possible.
IDs,
I mean, that's
because
possible.
the
Yeah.
distinctions that you're pointing out within each ID for viewpoint and illumination are small.
Yes,
Whereas
exactly. Exactly.
and they're not in the same orientation.
Yes.
So so I get confused when you show that plot and say you get good coding of viewpoint and illumination, because it must be in other dimensions that you're not showing in that T-SNE plot. That
Yeah.
You're getting that and they must be small distances. So that's dominated by identity.
Yes, exactly.
And
that's
then
why it works.
The second thing that confuses me is you don't look at the feature spaces earlier on. I know they're very hard because there are billions and billions of features.
Yes.
But if you
I know.
did, you
not-
might find that that's where the viewpoint representation is before identity. And I think that if you want to make the parallel to the visual system, looking at the earlier layers, as difficult as that is, and
I know, it's one of these things where I could spend the rest of my life on the top level representation, just because there's so much to do there, and that's what we were funded to do in the IARPA competition, is to make it work. And when it doesn't work, figure out why it doesn't work and analyze the representations, and are they having trouble with other race faces and so on. So the basic science here is really yet to come in some senses. So I agree with you. Studying, I think the analogy I'm most comfortable with yet, and I have trouble reconciling with the neuroscience in the multiple areas, but I don't know that much about it. So let's just say I don't know enough about it. I like DiCarlo's way of talking about this, the Cox and DiCarlo paper that came out in 2007, which was well before CNNs, where they just talk about what the visual system should be doing. And their point of view is that it shouldn't be eliminating this stuff or getting rid of it. It should be untangling it. So they talk about object untangling the manifold. So what happens layer to layer to layer is every layer is a different phase space. And every time you go to a different phase space, the similarity structure of the phase space changes. So at the bottom, we're talking about the similarity of images. And as you go further and further and further up, you're talking about the similarity of identities somehow. And so
decision boundaries flatten out. The idea is that decision boundaries flatten out for the desired feature. That's what the untangling is. So early on, viewpoint and illumination are tangled up.
Are not the decision. Yeah, they're not really.
But after
they're untangled.
they're
And
untangled.
You can read them
which means
out
the decision
linearly,
boundary
just
for
depending on
identity
different.
becomes flat.
Yeah.
Whereas the decision boundaries for those other things becomes tangled.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, that's
It's
okay
fine.
to
I like that.
tangle image, Because that's always been the challenge in the computer vision, is that the image similarity gets you nowhere for anything we really want. So you have to put it in a highly nonlinear space where the similarity space helps you find what you need. And you do need viewpoint. You do need all the other stuff. So, Gary. Okay. Oh.
Yeah, so one comment and one suggestion. So everybody seems to think DCNNs arose from whole cloth in 2012.
Okay, the TICS paper is a whole section. 1980, Fukushima introduced DCNNs. And there's just decades worth of it. And no.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Jan LeCun made it work in 1989.
Jan LeCun made it work with the character recognition and
Yeah.
so on. There's a nice section in that paper about what's different between now and then, and I think Carlos is going to talk about that. So.
Okay. And then being interested in how these things explain psychological results, I think it'd be really interesting to look at things like Tanaka and Farah again, where, Bob's nose versus Bob's nose and Bob's face. How well can you discriminate those? And that's something that I think would be really interesting to do. Plus looking at upside down faces with inverted features, etc.
Yep, all of these things are out there to be done.
Yeah, I just asked what the training times are like for these DCNNs. Apparently it's weeks.
Weeks, yeah. And
it's weeks on machines with 4 or 8 GPUs. So it's really GPU. If you had one GPU, it would be months. Yeah.
And you had a question, yes.
Anyway, I was wondering the same thing Jim was about the different layers and what there could be actually really interesting representations of different ones that you could be.
I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's a puzzle, and I completely agree, but one of the things that's a puzzle is that the architectures seem so uninterestingly related to the results. So like if you take Rajiv's latest network, what is it? How many layers is it? 101? 101, and essentially we get the same result on the MPI data set from the 101 layer network, which is much better, performs really at the level of forensic examiners, versus the Junchen network from 2015-2016 that had 7 layers. 7 layers. So if you go through, like, I worry that you spend all this time looking at the lower layers and it might not really.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. And then the other thing, the representation, I think is really interesting to try to reverse infer like what type of information's there. But also, you're assuming that all the features, you're going to weight them equally and by the way you're doing it. And I wonder if that's a problem or if you thought about ways to solve that. Or
that different features are more important or less important?
For different things you're probing. But right now, you're weighting them all equally, right? Because it's distance, the distance should be equal when you're.
Yeah, I mean, I think the network, like if you do a linear classifier, it allows differential weighting to do the prediction.
Yeah, exactly. So if you go that route, maybe you.
That's what we did, yeah.
Oh, I see.
So, I mean, no combination of those reasonably easy combinations of those features will predict the image data.
Okay.
So it is a linear readout. It's not very hard to get that information out of the end.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks.
So, sure.